Final recap video of the year for chapters 12 through 16 neurobiology, the nervous system. This test will count as your final, and on this test, you'll get to use front and back for a note sheet of one normal size piece of paper. So let's take a look at the nervous system. The nervous system has two main divisions. The first being the central nervous system, which is going to contain your brain and spinal cord. And that's a big player in our nervous system. It's going to integrate and process and coordinate sensory data, so the data that's coming in from our outside world, and process those motor commands, the reactions to that data that we're receiving. Then we have our peripheral nervous system, and our peripheral nervous system contains all of our cranial nerves, the nerves that come off of our brain, and our spinal nerves, the nerves that come off of our spinal cord. And then from there, we do a lot more divisions off the peripheral nervous system. We have the somatic nervous system, which is under our voluntary control, and the autonomic, which is involuntary. There's also the enteric nervous system, which is a network of neurons in your digestive tract. We can divide our nervous system into its functional divisions. We have the afferent division, which is bringing information to our nervous system through different types of receptors. And then we have the efferent system, which is bringing information away or out from our nervous system. You have your somatic again, which is controlling your skeletal muscle, your voluntary movements, and your autonomic, which is controlling your involuntary movements. We have things like our rest and digest or our fight and flight response. You just have these different diagrams showing you the different divisions, the anatomical divisions being the central and peripheral nervous system, and then you have your functional divisions. So then we got into the cells of the nervous system, or neurons, and there's different ways we can classify our neurons. We can classify them by their structure. They can be anaxonic, which are really rare. They're in your brain and spinal cord. You can have bipolar, unipolar, or multipolar. Multipolars are the ones that we look at, and they're the most common. And then we look at the different parts of a neuron. So for your test, be able to identify the different parts of a neuron and also be able to know the difference between a presynaptic cell, the cell that is going to receive the signal, receive the stimulus, and the postsynaptic cell. This is like neuron 2, where the presynaptic cell is going to receive that stimulus, and if it's strong enough, send that message down the axon to our postsynaptic cell. Like I said, be familiar with these terms, the different parts of a neuron, and be able to know what those different parts do, similar to your quiz. You need to know the two types of axonal transport. Anterograde flow being that the message is flowing from the cell body. That message got received by the dendrites, and it's going to send it down the axon terminal, or down the axon to the axon terminal. And then there's retrograde flow, which is the opposite. And this happens when people have rabies or heavy metal poisoning, that message is going to send backwards. It's going to start at the axon terminal and make its way towards the cell body. We talked about the different functional classes of neurons, and then we looked at neuroglial cells, or the supporting cells of our nervous system. And their job is to maintain homeostasis. They're going to form myelin, and they provide support and protection. Be familiar with the different types of neuroglia, and they're separated by what nervous system you find them in. In your central nervous system, you have astrocytes, epidermal cells, oligodendrocytes, and microglia. I would know what each function is for each of those cells. And in your peripheral nervous system, you have satellite cells and Schwann cells. Remember, Schwann cells make myelin for the peripheral nervous system. And then myelin, we've been talking a little bit about, is really important for our nervous system because it's an insulation that wraps around the axons of our neurons and allows us to speed up our electrical impulses. And how we tell if myelin is present is if we're looking at a scan or a picture of a brain or a spinal cord. If it has white matter, it looks lighter. It contains myelin. If it does not, it looks a little darker, and we call it gray matter. You can see that white versus gray matter in some of these images, and you can see how myelin is wrapping around the axons. Propagation is how fast an impulse moves down an axon, and there's two different types. There's total propagation, which occurs at unmyelinated axons, and that potential is just going to move continuously down the axon. And then there's saltatory or partial propagation, which occurs in myelinated axons, and what happens is that action potential is going to jump from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier, those spaces between the myelin, and it happens much faster. There's three different types of Axons, we have type A fibers, which are the fastest and they're myelinated. We find them in our skeletal motor neurons. There's type B, they're a little smaller, but they're still myelinated, and we find them in our smooth muscle, and our glands, and our cardiac muscle. And then type C are a lot smaller, they're unmyelinated, they're a lot slower, and we find them again in our smooth muscle, glands, and cardiac muscle. All right, so here's the bulk of what we learned. How do these neurons actually work? So the big thing with how neurons work is the ions sodium and potassium and where those ions are in relation to the cell and their movement. So you have to remember that there's going to be more sodium ions in your extracellular fluids or the outside of the cells, and then there's going to be more potassium ions inside of our cells in the cytoplasm of our neurons. Remember that resting potential is negative 70 millivolts, and there's a couple different steps to how neurons work. There's our resting potential. If we receive a stimulus and that stimulus is strong enough, it's going to collect at the axon hillock, the part where our cell body meets our axon. And once we reach over that threshold potential, it's going to send the message down the axon and actually go through that action potential step. So in order for those ions to move and to cause that action potential, there needs to be ion channels because ion channels are too large, or ions themselves are too large to fit through the cell membrane. So we have passive or leak channels, which are always open and they help maintain our resting potential. And then you have gated channels. They can be chemically gated, voltage gated, or mechanically gated. And that's what's going to allow a lot of our sodium potassium to move. And we have pictures of each of those. Remember your vocabulary terms, which I actually like more on this page, on the myogram page, which is the graph that we use to measure our action potential or the electricity in a neuron. You need to be familiar with resting potential, but the threshold potential is what we need for that impulse to fire, and that impulse is always going to fire under the all or none effect. Either it totally fires or it does not fire at all. Depolarization is when the cell is becoming more positive. Repolarization is when the cell is getting closer to negative 70, and hyperpolarization is when the cell goes below negative 70 millivolts to kind of reset itself before it receives its next signal. I would be familiar with this myogram and know where each step is, where resting potential, depolarization, repolarization, and our refractory periods are. And then we went through the actual steps of how action potential works and how those neurons are moving in and out of the cell, causing an electrical impulse. So step one, a stimulus has to be applied, and that stimulus is going to bring the cell membrane to its threshold potential of negative 60 millivolts. And once we're at that threshold potential, we can fire our signal. And that signal is going to get fired, causing those sodium-gated channels to open, and sodium is going to rush into the cell. And that causes depolarization. The cell is becoming more positive. After that step, the sodium channels are going to close and the potassium channels open. And potassium is going to diffuse out through the cell, which causes the cell to become more negative again, or repolarization. And then our final step is, we know at resting potential that there needs to be a greater concentration of sodium ions outside the cell and a greater concentration of potassium ions inside of the cell. But that's not what's happening right now. So we have to get our cell back to normal using the sodium-potassium pump. And that sodium-potassium pump is going to pump out 3 sodiums for every 2 potassiums it pumps in, and it's going to restore our membrane back to negative 70 millivolts. You might have noticed on those myograms or those graphs that there is time called the refractory period. The refractory period is the time where the neuron cannot receive any more impulses. No activity can happen during that time until the neuron resets itself. A synapse is at the end of a neuron, and it's what's used to communicate with other cells via neurotransmitters. So remember, those neuron transmitters get released from our axon terminals, and they can travel across the synapse when we're talking about chemical synapses, which are the most common. There's also electrical synapses, but we didn't talk about those really. Then we're done with action potential, and we're moving on to the parts of our nervous system. The first being our spinal cord. Your spinal cord is covered in a protective layer called the meninges, and we went into the basics of your spinal cord. So your spinal cord is going to have different roots on it, different extensions coming off of it. The first being the posterior or dorsal roots, which are bringing sensory information into the spinal cord. So it's picking up what you're receiving from your outside world, bring it to your spinal cord. And then you have dorsal and ventral roots branching off of your spinal cord, which has motor neurons, which are going to send the information back out. We talked about our vertebrae and the different numbers of vertebrae we have in each section. We also took a look at what a plexus is, which is a network of nerves, and we looked at our reflexes. Remember, with reflexes, you don't need your brain. I would be familiar with the path of how a reflex works, that a stimulus is applied and our receptor gets activated, and once that receptor is activated, it's going to send its message through a sensory neuron, and it's going to be received at the posterior root of the spinal cord. Then it's going to go to the anterior root of the spinal cord, and it's going to activate a motor neuron, which is going to cause a response. So the example is, like, if you touch something painful, you're going to pull it away right away. It's a quick response. Here's a graph of the reflex arc, if you prefer this over the writing, or not a graph, but a diagram. And then we started looking at the major parts of the brain. So the first major parts of the brain we looked at were the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the big main portion of our brain where conscious thought and memory and intellect and consciousness comes into play, where the cerebellum is going to coordinate our motor patterns, like complex movements like throwing a ball or doing a cartwheel, and it's also going to adjust motor output, what movements we're sending out. Then we moved into our brainstem, and your brainstem can be divided into 4 parts. You have the diencephalon, which is going to relay and process sensory information that helps control your motion and autonomic functions, as well as hormone production. You have your midbrain, which is processing visual and auditory data. It helps make your reflexes and helps you maintain consciousness. Your pons is going to relay information, and it also plays a role in subconscious somatic and visceral controls. So it's controlling like what's going on in our skin and with inside our organs. And then at the bottom of our brainstem, you have the medulla oblongata, which is going to send information, receive information. It also plays a big role in like your basic functions, like your cardiovascular functions, your heart beating, your breathing, your respiratory functions, and your digestive tracts. And then we talked about the lobes of the brain. The lobes of your brain are named the same as the bones of your skull. You have your frontal lobe, you have your temporal lobe, which is where a lot of auditory association happens and where you're able to process smells. You have your occipital lobe, where vision association is taking place, and your parietal lobe as well. Here's pictures showing the different lobes of your brain. And then we took a look at the different cranial nerves, or the nerves branching off of our brain that we have. I would be familiar with what each nerve helps control. And then we had a bunch of pictures of nerves. I'm going to skip over all those pictures and go straight to senses. So with senses, there's 2 vocabulary terms that you need to know. There's sensation, which is when you're receiving the information. You're like feeling or smelling or tasting the sense. And then there's perception, which is you're aware of that sense. And there's a difference between senses. We have our general senses, which are like temperature, touch, pain, pressure, vibration. And then there's our special senses. Olfaction is smelling, gustation is tasting, vision, equilibrium, and hearing. A lot of what we're going to be focusing on are more general senses. So with those general senses, we have receptors for them. We have nociceptors, which help you feel pain. You have thermoreceptors, which help you feel hot and cold. And you have 3 different types of mechanoreceptors, which are tactile, which is touch, baroreceptors, which is pressure, and proprioceptors help tell you about your body's position. It helps you know where the joints of your body are at any given time. And then that's it. So happy studying for your last test. If you are a senior, junior, sorry you have one more, but that's it.